Update 5. Just so everyone understands, a lot of this information came from Dan and my parents. So I'm just telling you what I know. Shit really hit the fan when Dan suddenly called out his wife as a cheater in March. This shocked us all, because we thought he was a complete pushover to her. But no, he's not. At least not anymore. You all know how he treated me when I was on his bad side. Well, his wife wasn't spared that ire at all. He started putting pieces together about her deceit after finally pulling his head out of his ass, and secretly got DNA tests for all his kids. 3 of the kids are his. But the youngest one, the baby, was not. For the record, Dan and I both have pretty dark straight hair that's almost black. Same with our parents. SIL's hair is straight and pretty dark too. But the baby's hair is lighter and a bit curly. At first, Anne just thought it was because of the baby's age. SIL kept playing it off and said that it would darken in time. But the baby's hair never got darker. I guess that was Dan's biggest clue. He confronted his wife with the DNA results in front of our parents, and she broke down sobbing that it was a mistake. SIL pulled out all the Darvo stops of denying, trickle-truthing, and gaslighting. But Dan had none of it, and actually had done more to find out about her affair than I would have ever thought. I knew he was smart. He just let himself be dumb. He had detailed proof of her cheating with phone records, texts he got off her phone, bank records, and the DNA test. He even identified the man she's cheating with, who is likely the father since he has much lighter-colored curly hair. The evidence against her was crystal clear, and Dan said she was so bad at hiding her affair, he didn't even have a hard time figuring any of it out once he started looking. My parents demanded that SIL leave their house immediately. That's when she went psycho on them all. First in just yelling, but she quickly got physical. The police had to be called by my mother. And yeah, SIL was arrested. She scratched up Dan and my father quite a bit with her long fake nails, and even harmed her eldest kid in the crossfire by hitting him hard enough to have a black eye and nosebleed when he tried to intervene. Dan was smart enough to have his phone recording nearby when he confronted her. So the police had all they needed to arrest her for assault. SIL's parents had to drive over to bail her out. Then they came back for the baby, SIL's stuff, and her car as well. A couple days after SIL got bailed out, she showed up at my house because I was apparently next on her shit list. As soon as I opened the door, she went on a delusional rant where she called me out about posting on Reddit. Then said I was the entitled bane of her existence. I'm not sure, but I think she might have been high on something because this felt extra crazy for her, and her eyes didn't look right. She claimed mothers with young children are the most sacred thing in the world. Then I went on yelling that giving up my house shouldn't have been too much to ask for, because supporting the family was the least I could have done. And if I had, then her family would still be together. When I tried to talk while she was spewing all that out, she actually attempted to shove me and cover my mouth. She even had her hand poised like she was ready to scratch me. Well, that went about as well with me, as you can expect. I'm not exactly one to be threatened, and told her I'd call the police if she didn't take her hands off me right that moment. I also told her I got all it on my doorbell camera. She started panicking the moment she heard camera. Then I ended up verbally savageting her to the point she was backing off my porch. I told her she had some gall to call me entitled when she's exactly that. She didn't work for anything she had anymore, cheated on her husband, and got pregnant from her affair partner, made my mother do most of the parenting for her children, spent Dan's money till they were in a financial hole, and acted entitled to my home to the point of trying to steal it. I called her entitled X 1000, and that she's a greedy bitch who is blinded by narcissism. Then I told her to stop blaming me for her own actions and to never show up at my house again. Being told all that was pretty much all SIL needed to hear before jumping back into her car, then peeled out and sped off. This was finally the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Now that she was separated from Dan, I ended up finally going to the police and filing a report on her for harassment and the assault she'd done on me last year. And her putting her hands on me at my front porch only added to it. The police have it all on record now, and I gave copies of the video to Dan for his divorce lawyer. And yes, I did file for a restraining order against SIL. It was easily granted because it was obvious the woman was unhinged. She's not made a social media post about me since that I could see, but that's just because she put her profile in private. I hope her blame ship against me has long since sailed. Either way, she's left me alone. SIL was still with her affair partner during the divorce. At the time, I had no real idea of what kind of man he was. But any person who monkeys with someone else's spouse and even has a child with them really doesn't have a lot of morals to begin with. Once the divorce was underway, SIL admitted that Dan just wasn't man enough for her anymore because he couldn't afford to give her the lifestyle she wanted. She actually believed herself to be on the level of a trophy wife and that she deserves to be with someone wealthy. Dan said he pulled a me and maniacally laughed at her. He said she was nowhere near hot enough to be a trophy wife, along with mentioning any other faults she had. SIL ended up humiliated by this and ran off like a child. Due to having to live with her parents, SIL was forced to work in their family business because Dan wasn't giving her access to his bank accounts anymore. She'd already maxed out all the credit cards he previously gave her, and she griped about having to work for her parents despite having a college degree. But I think they were the only ones who'd employ her anyway, since she's got a criminal record and a decade-long gap in her resume. I've heard from Dan that her parents were severely disappointed in her as well. But that was just a rumor. They could be just as bad as her for all I know. Either way, the shit show of a divorce really took off once it got going. SIL didn't walk away with much from it, especially because she had an affair, physically hurt her FIL, husband, and eldest child, and it's in that false state, like I mentioned earlier. So she kissed any chance of getting her way goodbye. I'll go into detail about it in the final post. Update 6. Dan's lawyer pulled some strings to get the divorce started as fast as possible. But it cost him. I don't know the more specific details or how much it all costs. They never told me. SIL, on the other hand, was financially backed into a corner very badly. And you know what can happen when you corner an animal. She fought back, but the law was not on her side, nor was her dwindling finances. SIL's parents had to pay for a lawyer for her, and not a very good one either. Also, she actually brought her affair partner to the divorce court to testify on her behalf. This guy was a real piece of work. He had a bronze tongue and a charming smile he tried to use to his advantage. He claimed SIL had been wronged by an incompetent husband, which is why she sought the arms of another man. He claimed he was ready to take responsibility for his child he had fathered with SIL, but that SIL would still be needing the alimony for helping support herself and care for said child. He remarked that because Dan at the time was still on the birth certificate, alimony should be one of his obligations. Dan said this guy used big words and a charming smile, but seemed an extra special kind of stupid. And coming from Dan, that's saying something. The judge was also not swayed in the slightest, and told the bronze-tongued lout that he was a hypocrite for saying he was ready to take responsibility for his own child, while also holding his hand out for money from the man whose marriage he'd helped ruin. That shut him up. Dan was prepared to sue his wife's affair partner for alienation of affection too. However, that fell through. I guess it would have been on Dan to prove how much she loved him before the affair started. But after her mask came off and we saw the real her, we're not sure if she ever really loved him at all, or if she just loved having a meal ticket. Someone here pointed out SIL probably kept popping out kids to avoid getting a job. And you may have been right. Either way, SIL tried dragging out the divorce. But Dan's lawyer and the judge kept that from happening much. I swear, Dan must have seriously lucked out because he got one of the meanest and most unsympathetic to cheaters judges in the state. And all the evidence we had on SIL made it easy to keep her from playing the victim. So instead, she just let her real bitch self out, since there was no point in hiding it anymore. The court had all of the records provided by Dan and myself, police reports, photos, and recordings to prove she was an abusive narcissist. There was a mountain against SIL that she had no way to climb over or hike around. She tried standing against the mountain, but that was prime avalanche territory. In the end of the divorce, SIL struck a deal to end things quickly. Dan takes 3/4 of the credit card debt, gets his name off the affair baby's birth certificate, and SIL walked away with only partial custody of her children, no alimony, but also without most of the credit debt she racked up. Her being legally employed by her parents meant she had an income of her own to fall back on to start paying off her debts. She can see her other kids almost whenever she wants and can take them on weekends, but for whatever reason has made very few attempts to even see them. She took them out to eat fast food a few times, but she never took them home with her. The kids are back in school now, so that gives her even less opportunities to see them. You'd think her parents would want to see their grandchildren, but they haven't contacted Dan about it. They barely saw Dan's children before that too. Now, they may not even bother to see them at all. Do they hate kids or something? Even Dan doesn't know. But he tells me that his in-laws were always indifferent to him. As for Dan, well, he really did love his wife a lot. So the betrayal of her cheating made him hit the bottle hard. Rewind back to the night of his confrontation with his wife. He came to me in a stupor with a whiskey bottle in hand and his face all scratched up and covered in bandages. I wouldn't say he was drunk yet, but I freaked out seeing him looking like that at first, then berated him for driving under the influence. But that didn't really mean much to him compared to the betrayal of his cheating harlot of a soon-to-be ex-wife. We spent a few hours hanging out in my camper so as not to disturb my tenants. All the while Dan was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and crying that he's a fool, and how he regretted ever marrying SIL. Pretty much any time he mentions her now, he just refers to her as that bitch. So that's ex-SIL's nickname now. Ironically, this time together was the most bonding Dan and I have done in 15 years. While he didn't exactly apologize to me, he called himself a shitty human being with terrible taste in women, then said I at least didn't make his mistakes. Despite all he previously did to me, he's still my younger brother, and I couldn't risk letting him try to drive home. So I told him to stay the night and managed to take his keys, then set up the bunk in my camper for him to use. I rented out my spare rooms after all. He was in no shape to drive home, and if he'd taken an Uber, he'd have to pay for it and then have to come back for his car later. He was still a depressed, crying mess and didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that. And frankly, I was worried he'd do something insanely stupid if I let him leave. I didn't want him to sleep in the house, so putting him in the camper was the best option. Just because that bitch fucked him over doesn't mean I suddenly trusted him. So better for him to sleep it off in the camper. We both spent time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Poker was no fun with just two people, and the old maid was just boring. Thankfully, I had an Uno deck too and an old-school battleship game. You really like those? It was enough to keep him distracted until he was finally willing to lay down after running out of whiskey. He threw up a lot of it in a bucket anyway, but he was not opposed to sleeping in my camper. In fact, he found the idea kind of cool. Dan had a lot of questions for me as to how I'd lived in the camper for as long as I did, and I answered them all, if not just to keep him busy. But I needed to go to bed myself since I had to be up early, so I left him with my portable DVD player and a couple of movies. That way he could amuse himself alone for a while, if he even managed to stay awake. Before leaving for work in the morning, I popped in while Dan was passed out in the bunk and left a bottle of ibuprofen and an energy drink on the counter of the camper's kitchenette, along with his car keys and a letter explaining how to leave through the backyard gate. He saw himself out without trouble around 1:30 p.m. About a month after ex-SIL, aka that bitch, was kicked out, Dan came to me asking to borrow my camper. I guess he found it more comfortable than I'd thought when he slept in it, and he fully admitted he didn't ask sooner out of pride. But with his soon-to-be ex-wife out of the house, he decided to give up his room for his eldest kid. He's got 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the eldest and now 8 years old. The kids were all forced to share a room until that point. They just had curtains up for the boy's half of the room, but the boy often slept on the couch to avoid his sisters. I know the poor kid was really desperate for his own room, so I guess Dan decided to finally make a better decision as a dad, and came to see me in order to beg to borrow my camper so his son could have his room. If he could have afforded it, he'd have bought his own camper instead of relying on me, and even said as much. I hadn't even gotten the chance to use the camper for actual camping yet, but I caved and let him use it since it was actually for a good cause, and he promised to buy his own in time anyway. No, I didn't ask for rent money for the camper. Dan is in enough of a financial hole as it is right now. Ex-SIL and the divorce drained him, and I've learned that I get far better results with family lately by not being spiteful. I loaded my camper up and put it down in my parents' backyard, and my father put in a 30-amp breaker so it'll have enough power for Dan to run heat and AC when he needs it. I do miss the camper. After all that time living in it, it kind of felt like it was a part of me. But the only reason I loaned it out was for the sake of Dan's kids. Pretty much the only reason I still do anything for my parents or Dan is for the sake of those kids, as I've bonded with them. And yes, I know I may not get the camper back for quite some time, and likely not in the kind of condition I lent it out in, But I've warned Dan and my parents that they will be financially responsible for any damage they do to the camper, as well as its upkeep for as long as they have it. I also took many time-stamped pictures and video of the camper inside and outside before lending it out, so I can prove its condition before it leaves. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to my terms. So that's as good as a contract. With the financial drain of the divorce, Dan's not going to be able to get a place of his own for years, I'll bet. Though he seems to have no complaints about living in the camper at least. But I don't know if he actually likes it or if he's just putting up a front. But I can guess it reminds him of the backyard forts we had as kids, since that's how it felt with me sometimes. Either way, he's living in it now. I did get some major props from the extended family for letting him borrow it too. I'm now referred to by a lot of them as the good brother Dan doesn't deserve. Either way, I think getting rid of SIL was a great first step in mending the family as a whole. I still have little care for my brother and parents after the way they treated me all my life. But I'm not going to let Dan's kids suffer for it. Those kids have actually really warmed up to me. They're actually happy to see me when I come over or when they visit me. I've even babysat a few times. Now that they don't have their mother's toxic around, they've become much nicer kids. Especially to me. I'm actually getting to enjoy being an uncle now. My mother is still doing the bulk of the parenting for my nibblings, and she's been acting as nice as possible to stay on my good side. My father often looks very defeated in my presence, but otherwise he's been either stoically quiet or just generally nice to me. But he won't talk to me much, though that's leagues better than how he was before at least. I'm not letting my guard down either way. My parents do seem more happy that my ex-SIL is gone, and they often say they don't know what they ever saw in her. My mother especially, because the two of them butted heads over who was mom in the house for a long time. Now for the last part. At the same time as the divorce, Dan sued to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the baby that wasn't his. That bitch didn't really want to change it because it meant no more child support from Dan if she did. However, there was a court-ordered paternity test for the man identified as the baby's father. I was prepared to laugh in case it turned out he wasn't the father either. But he was. And Dan's lawyer had a long talk with ex-SIL's lawyer. Ex-SIL had no leg to stand on, and Dan was ready to go to bat to make her situation even worse. She didn't have the finances to fight him any longer and agreed to changing the birth certificate. The bronze-tongued lout who'd knocked her up did man up to take financial responsibility as a parent. But he ended up not staying with SIL. He contacted Dan through his lawyer to tell him he'd broken up with that bitch and that he wouldn't bother him again. I checked the social media of that guy after Dan linked me to it, and the lout was upset that now he's financially responsible for a child he never planned to have, and that he's too young for this. Guys, from what Dan's lawyer was able to find out, that man is just over 40. He looks younger than he is, but he's by no means a young man. Shortly after that, he put his online profile on private. ex-SIL did the same with hers a long time prior. So I've no more information left to give. This may be the end. ex-SIL is out of our hair. My parents and brother have finally made a real effort to be better people. I'm surprisingly happy as an uncle, and my house is still my house. Update 7. No surprise ex-SIL saw my Reddit posts. She can't contact me about them in any way but with a lawyer thanks to my restraining order against her. And she likely can't afford to get a lawyer right now anyway, since the divorce financially drained her too. So she bitched to Dan about it and demanded he tell me to delete my Reddit account. But not only has Dan read my recent posts, he no longer cares. He said they serve as a reminder of the prick he used to be, and he's not losing sleep about it. Besides, I've still helped him out despite all he's done to me. So, he's not going to be upset about it. My parents have also made sure to try and treat Dan and I more equally when I'm around too. My father is still a man of few words around me though. Someone pointed out that changing now after so long of treating me as the opposite of Dan means he doesn't know how to connect with me anymore. And I think they're right. I don't mind the way he is now though. My mother has also developed a habit of saying she's sorry about every little thing in my presence. Dan told me that she and my father have been reamed a lot by extended family and their counselor. And now my mother feels like she needs to apologize for everything. This is all a stark contrast to how they used to treat me. Also, I didn't talk about before what XSL's opinion was on Dan borrowing my camper so his son could have his and XSL's old bedroom. While like a stereotypical bully, she looked down on him and mocked him about it because now he's living like a bum, as she put it. But Dan took it all in stride and asked if she was done yet, because he knew this was exactly how she'd react. And he just plain doesn't care anymore. She's borderline dead to him, and her insults were on deaf ears. Then he pointed out to her that he was living out of the camper because he was putting his kids ahead of himself so his son could have his own room. Something his ex never did, despite being their mother. She just weaponized her children and pregnancy to keep from working and to emotionally blackmail everyone. Then he asked her to remind him how that was working out for her. Mind you, this was early on in their divorce. I'm sure you can all guess her reaction. Dan said his ex did have quite the tantrum about my recent posts, but no one has bothered to contact me on her behalf to take them down. So she just has to live with the well-deserved shame. She has been trying to act nicer to Dan lately. Guess the grass isn't so green living with her parents. Dan tolerates her as the mother of his children whenever they meet. But nothing more. He will never take her back. He's told me that he can never look at her like he used to, and the very thought of her turns him off emotionally. So XSL pretty much has no chance of reconciliation. I have no new info on XSIL's affair partner. His social media is still locked down. Same with XSIL's. And it's likely to remain that way as long as I have a chance of reading them. Update 8. Happened in the middle of the night / very early morning on the 1st. I suspect it was my XSIL, but the person my cameras recorded was wearing layers of heavy sweats and had their face wrapped up along with big glasses covering the eyes. You couldn't really tell if they were a man or woman. They came on foot too, so no identifying a car. They did look about XSIL's height though, but that's not much in the way of evidence on its own. If it was XSIL, she knew about my cameras. So covering her face and body for petty eggy revenge was probably the smartest thing she's done in years. Way to finally put her college degree to use. By egging a beat-up old pick-em-up truck. The egger showed up around 3 a.m. I was deep asleep and didn't hear anything. Whoever it was that appeared that night quickly threw a dozen eggs or so all over my truck. They didn't attempt to do any more damage at least, and were gone in a flash as soon as the last egg was thrown. I didn't see the mess till I was leaving for work in the morning. I ran my truck through a local car wash during my lunch break. That took most of the egg off. Had to scrub it a bit more later after work. Egg really isn't good for the paint. But the truck is from the 90s and doesn't exactly look mint anyway. I did take photos and filed a police report with the CCTV footage as evidence. But so far nothing has come of it. There was no real damage other than my minor irritation and $15 at a car wash. If XSL did do this, then she was smart enough to only throw eggs and not key my paint or slash my tires. So my insurance wouldn't be involved. I don't think much will come of the police report, as the cops seem to dismiss it as a probable prank by a teenager. I get they were probably overworked, but at least the report will keep a paper trail in case of future incidents. I waited till now to post because I wondered if anything else would happen. But no, just right back to peace and quiet. I would appreciate any good advice on the matter though, just in case something like this happens again. Small update. Asked around to some people on the street about cameras possibly seeing the person who egged my car. Our responses ranging from "we don't have cameras" to "it was Halloween" and "people pull stupid pranks." Let it go. The few people who were helpful told me that I waited way too long to ask and the footage auto-deleted. So basically the egger got away. But if it was SIL, I'm guessing she had to walk around a half-mile in those sweats just to not get her car spotted on camera or something. It wouldn't surprise me if she questioned if it was even worth the effort. Oh well, I guess I'll just wait and see if the egger comes back next year. I did hand out printed pictures of the egger though, and even stapled a few up on posts. So now people in my neighborhood are aware at least. The tenants renting out 2 rooms in my house have stayed out of it. And I don't really blame them. It's not their problem. Update 9. Dan returned my camper, and XSIL got a DUI. But I've also got a copycat that has made my family upset all over again to start this off. I came back after all this time to find 500 messages in my inbox and 130 unanswered PMs. Please don't PM me anymore. There's just too many to answer. So if you PM me and I clicked ignore, I'm sorry. Just know that's why. It was not personal. I just felt too overwhelmed to reply to so many. But that's not what brought me back to Reddit. I decided to stay away at least a year because my posts were not exactly boosting family morale. So I didn't log in for quite some time. But then the other day, my brother Dan spotted a video with an unbelievably similar to mine in far too many ways. Only it was about an OP with a twin sister instead of a SIL. But it had so much of the same. Entitled narcissistic parents, guy treated like shit all his life, and then rendered homeless, golden child sibling. Keeping the favoritism a closely guarded secret from family while the OP was growing up. Sister still in her 20s has 3 kids and was pregnant with a 4th. Sister's eldest son attacks OP, and above all them trying to steal the OP's house by breaking in while he wasn't home. So many parts were nearly identical. Even 2 lines like "suck it up" and "my house is not up for grabs" were in the video. My parents and brother are frankly pissed, and I wasn't happy seeing the video either. We've all been trying hard to get past our previous family dynamic and what XSIL put us all through. You can imagine it took a lot for me to let go of my grudges. But in a year, my parents and Dan have improved more than I'd seen in my entire life before that. And I love me siblings to pieces. So whoever wrote that copycat story, congratulations, you just sent my entire family right back into needing therapy. And yes, my family is aware I'm making this post. Now with that ran over, here's what I hope to be my final update. Now for what was stated in the title. I had a few naysayers before, but Dan kept his word. My camper was returned to me a few months ago and in good condition. Dan took good care of it and thoroughly cleaned it before giving it back. He and our father also resealed the roof on it once while it was in their care. Inside, it's no worse for wear than it was when I was living in it. Only I got it back smelling like pine cleaner. There was some minor drama while Dan was living in my camper from a neighbor right behind them. Not quite sure she qualifies as a Karen, but she was close enough. She started yelling at them from over the fence about the camper and started threatening police. My brother and father went off on her and then explained Dan was living in the camper so his son could have his bedroom. Well, the neighbor still wasn't happy, but stopped with the threats. My father talked to her husband later, though, and he was bull mad at her. Then he apologized on her behalf and said Dan was doing a good thing by giving up his room to his son. The neighbor husband also congratulated Dan on kicking out XSIL and said he was always afraid to mention before. But she was just a horrid woman. We can all agree on that now. So yeah, the neighbors aren't a problem anymore. Dan and our father managed to get some money together on the side and bought a slightly bigger camper to set up in our parents' backyard. We needed my truck just to move it, but we got it in there. It's basically the best Dan can do right now till the credit debts his ex piled up are paid off. And even then, he's got the future of his kids to plan for. He may be living in that camper for the next 10 years, but it's preferable to how it was when he was married. His ex-wife certainly can't and won't be contributing to college funds for the kids, except maybe for her affair baby. Dan's camper is admittedly better than mine, and it's newer, bigger, and has its own bathroom. Mine does not, although Dan never really uses said bathroom. It's basically become a closet since the toilet and shower are so tiny. If he needs to take a leak or something, he just goes in the house. Dan and I had a joking laugh about me being jealous he's got the better hobo house, and we bantered like sarcastic gentlemen about it. He kitted out his camper with some better amenities, like a flat-screen TV complete with streaming, video games, and DVD. He said it feels like he really has his own place now, even though he's just in the backyard. And he's much happier now that he's divorced. Dan tells me one day he'll get a truck too, just so he can move the camper on his own someday. But for now, he's sticking with his minivan for the sake of his kids. So his camper is sitting pretty where it is, and mine is back in my backyard where it belongs, though it's not gone and used. I temporarily rented it to a cousin who moved into the area for work, and they were only in the camper about a month before finding their own apartment. Other than that, it serves as a guest house when needed. Relatives come by to use it when in town so as to not need a motel. My nephew has come over to stay in it a few times for fun as well. His sisters don't really have an interest. The camper is the closest he's ever been to camping. Same here, sadly, because I didn't buy that camper to camp, but to live. As for my parents, they've gotten therapy. My mother got medicated for her mental problems and fully acknowledges her terrible past mistakes as a parent with all of the favoritism, as does my father. My father is still awkward around me, but he's been fairly active in his church and is working hard to rebuild the family reputation as best he can. And Dan has cut back on drinking a lot since he isn't so stressed out anymore. He's even taken up exercising. He's in pretty good shape now. And he told me his ex-wife saw the picture of him he posted online after shedding 20 pounds and called him to compliment. He didn't take the bait. As for the holidays, my parents, brother, and nibblings all came to my Christmas Eve party last year, along with most of the other relatives who came the year prior. No problems at all, save for the fact none of them could stay the night in my spare rooms anymore since I rented them out. Both of my tenants were away, seeing their own families too. Things went swimmingly. Not only was XSL not invited, she wouldn't have been able to crash the party anyway because of my restraining order against her. But she also barely made any attempt to spend time with her other kids either. She only bothered to see them twice a month at best. She didn't even send them any gifts for Christmas or birthdays since being outed as a cheater. And the kids were initially pretty upset about that. But now they just don't care. XL, I guess, decided she was going to try to live like she was single again, despite having a baby at home. And it didn't go well, because life gave her one hell of a cheese slap. On New Year's, XSL went out late to party like it was 1999, and she got pulled over by a cop on her way home. She got arrested for DUI, and her car was impounded. She called Dan while being arrested, begging him to come get her car to keep it from going to impound. He told her he was not helping her, and she could deal with it herself. Dan drank and drove, so it was kind of a little hypocritical. But this woman put him through so much, I don't blame him for rebuffing her. Some flying monkey of XSIL called Dan to berate about him being a terrible person. Pretty sure this was the same woman who called me a while back. Dan had none of her shit and went off on her with a long tirade about his ex's cheating, what happened in the divorce, and that he has no sympathy for his ex since she left him with mounds of credit card debt and she does nothing for their kids anymore. The flying monkey didn't call back. We still don't know who she was, but Dan said she sounded like a religious nut. XSIL went to court, and she pleaded guilty for the DUI. Dan found this out because she called him claiming that because of the DUI, she wouldn't be seeing her other kids anytime soon. She told him she was sentenced to take a 6-month DUI class, in which time her license was suspended until completion, and she won't be allowed to drink at all, which is the part she was most upset about. I've heard of these classes before. They make you take regular and at times random urine tests, and when you finally get your license back, you have to have a camera and breathalyzer installed in your car for a year. Also increased insurance rates for the DUI on record. XSL has not been having a fun time, but I have no pity for her. I don't drink and drive. Sadly, that's all the info I have on XSIL, as she's kept minimal contact with Dan for some time now. And eventually she'll probably stop contacting him altogether unless absolutely necessary. I don't know anything else about SIL's parents or her affair baby. Even Dan doesn't know, but I do still have a bit of info on someone else. Remember XSL's affair partner, the bronze-tongued lout? Well, he made his social media public again, and he doesn't seem to acknowledge the existence of XSIL or his child at all. Dan tried to message him and promptly got an immediate block. So the guy is just being an ass and acting like his shit doesn't stink. Whatever. His knocking up XSL got her out of the family anyway. So in a way, we're all thankful to that AP bastard. That's everything I have, and hopefully won't need to come back again. Unless my truck gets egged again next Halloween.